Today, we're going to discuss 3 mistakes that you must avoid with suited connectors. Suited connectors can be extremely profitable if you play them right. Most of you, though, play them incorrectly at some point, either pre-flop, on the flop, or the turn, or on the river on a very regular basis. And if you can fix whatever leaks you have in your game, it's going to drastically increase your win rate. So today, we're going to be discussing 3 big errors. Number 1, people call too often pre-flop. They think they should see the flop every time. Number 2, they play their draws too aggressively on the flop. And number 3, they fail to bluff when they miss on the river. We're going to go through a bunch of GTO examples to discuss how you should play so that you know how to play well in all the common spots, and then you can adjust to whatever mistakes your opponents make. So, most people call too often pre-flop. Here we're looking at 80 big blind, deep, multi-table tournament charts, which do allow you to call slightly wide because there's no rake coming out of each pot, and there's a big blind ante. If there's a rake coming out of each pot and no big blind ante, you have to play even tighter. And if you're shallower stacked, you also have to play even tighter than I'm showing you here. So let's take a look first at low jack versus under the gun. This means the under the gun player, 9-handed, raises it up, folds around to us in the low jack seat, which is first stacked if we were 6-handed. Take a look at all these suited connectors: 10-9 suited, 9-8 suited, 8-7 suited, 6-5 suited, 5-4 suited, 4-3 suited. These hands all just fold. You don't even call and see the flop. If your opponent makes it 2 big blinds, you just let it go immediately. That may seem insane to some players. How could you possibly just fold the 8-7 suited? You have to realize when there are a lot of players yet to act, the suited connectors go way down in value. What about if we are in the cutoff versus an under the gun raiser? Now you see we get to play some suited connectors, but again, like not every time. 4-3 suited is folding, 6-4 suited, 7-5 suited, 8-6 suited, 9-7 suited, Jack-8 suited, all of those fold. You may say, those are suited gappers, not suited connectors. Stay on topic. You have to realize that while 9-7 suited is worse than 9-8 suited, it's not like a million times worse. The hands are comparable. I realize you don't make as many straights, but you see these are hands that should be folded. And a lot of you out there in the cutoff do not like to fold hands like 9-7 suited and 8-6 suited. You send me hand histories, I see the stuff you're calling with. It is important to note we are talking about against an under-the-gun raiser who should have a strong range. As your opponent raises wider, either because they like to raise wide ranges or because they're in a later position, you do get to call a little bit wider. But even then, you're not going to get carried away with calling with the 7-5 suited every single time. It just doesn't happen. Let's take a look at on the button. This is the widest you get to play against an under-the-gun range, unless you're in the big blind. You see here, now you do get to call the suited gappers, but you still don't get to call stuff like 10-7 suited, 9-6 suited, 8-5 suited, 4-3 suited. These hands just fold. They're not good enough. Also note, some of the suited connected hands are being used as 3-bet bluffs. I know we're saying that you call too often pre-flop, but a lot of you never 3-bet them. If under the gun raises, you never 3-bet the 10-8 suited or the 8-7 suited or the 7-6 suited, but you can see here that the hands in red are 3-betting some small portion of the time, right? And you should. You're allowed to get out of line and be a little bit splashy and aggressive. But this is a spot where I do think a lot of people, again, splash a little bit too wide. However, the spot they splash around the most is when they are in the middle positions. Like you see here, low jack versus under the gun, all the marginal suited connectors just fold. So make sure you do that. Number 2, many players play draws too aggressively on the flop. So we're going to go through a few game theory optimal examples here, and I'm going to show you that a lot of the draws are not raising. And this is going to be especially true as the stack to pot ratio starts to get somewhat shallow. And that's because if someone bets and you raise, and then they shove on you, you have to fold out a draw that has 35-ish% equity against your opponent's range. And that is a disaster. You do not want to fold out any hand that's going to win 35% of the time if you can help it. So you do a lot of calling. Also, when you're in position, you're going to call a lot. Also, when you do not have the range and the nut advantage, you're going to call a lot. All of these topics should be very familiar to you if you've gone through the Cash Game Masterclass or the Tournament Masterclass at pokercoaching.com. Check it out. Go there. You're going to learn a ton because hopefully all this stuff is already known to you. But I know, because again, you all send me a bunch of hand histories, that you are messing up these spots. So let's take a look at this. 40 big blinds deep. In a tournament, the low jack raises, you call on the button. with this entire range here. Notice you don't have aces, kings, queens, or ace king a lot of the time because you would have 3-bet those before the flop. We have a poker coaching app. All of our pre-flop ranges are in the app for you to see and use as you see fit. Notice you don't have 10-6 suited or king-8 offsuit because you would have folded those pre-flop. Okay? Flop comes ace of spades, 7 of hearts, 6 of diamonds. And the low jack bets 1.7 big blinds, which is their most commonly used bet size. Sometimes they're going to bet bigger, sometimes they're going to bet smaller, but this is the most commonly used bet size in GTO world. Here is our response. Notice the hands in red are raising, hands in green are calling, hands in blue are folding, hands in gray are not in our range. And you see, you're not raising very often at all on ace 7-6. We're only really raising some ace queen, ace king, pocket sevens, pocket sixes, 7-6, and then a few draws. And our draws in this scenario are actually going to be kind of junky draws, like jack 9, jack 8, queen 8, queen 9, with backdoor draws, backdoor flush draws. Notice, though, very importantly, 9-8 does not actually raise all that often at all, which is the best open-ended straight draw. A lot of people think in this spot, all right, open-ended straight draw, I'm going to raise. But no, 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 no. You have to realize in this spot, we completely lack the nut advantage because the opponent has all combinations of aces, ace king, ace queen. They have ace 7 suited, ace 6 suited, pocket sevens, pocket sixes. And while we do have some of those hands, the fact that they have more aces and ace king and ace queen is going to force us to just not raise all that often at all because we don't want to run our ace 3 into their ace king, right? We want to lose as little as we possibly can. So because we don't get to raise a lot for value, we also don't get to raise a lot as a bluff. And you'll see that when that's the case, you certainly don't raise all of your open-ended straight draws. Notice also even like the junkier gut shots, like 10-9 does not raise, right? It raises a little bit, but not all that often. I think a lot of people, though, raise these every time. And then let's say your opponent does bet 1.7. If you make it 6 and they just rip it in for 38, you have to fold. And that's terrible. And if they call, you're probably in pretty bad shape. That's also pretty bad. Let's take a look at another spot. Here, 40 big blinds deep again. Low jack raises. You call the big blind. This time your range is going to be way wider. And we're going to be out of position. So the only thing that's changed here is your position has changed. You're now defending from the big blind compared to on the button. So you're out of position and you have a wider range. All right, flop comes ace 7-6. You check, they bet 1.5 big blinds, our most commonly used bet size. Here's how we respond now. And notice, we're raising a whole lot more often. And we're raising a whole lot more often because we now have 7-6 offsuit, ace 7 offsuit, and ace 6 offsuit, which are effective nut hands that the opponent does not have in their pre-flop raising range. So we get to raise more often. However, despite that, because of our stack to pot ratio, we don't actually get to raise with all the open-ended straight draws. Notice 8-5 suited raises, but take a look, 9-8 offsuit and 9-8 suited do not raise every time. 5-4 is raising about half the time, which is not every time. I want to make that crystal clear. Half the time is not 100% of the time. I think a lot of people get it in their minds if they looked at this chart. All right, 5-4 raises half the time, so I'm going to raise it. But you see it's calling half the time. 9-8, as you see, is not raising every time as well. It's raising some, but not every time. And I want to make that as clear as I possibly can. You do not have to always take the aggressive action with your straight draws because this is a very similar spot to the other scenario where if we check raise and then get jammed, we have to fold with our straight draws, and that is very, very bad. I will say, from out of position, you should be more inclined to raise in general because you want to essentially get the money in immediately with your very good hands, because if you check call, your opponent's going to be able to check the turn if they want, and then you're going to have a tough time playing a big pot. But in this scenario, you'll see the draws are still not raising every time. Be less inclined to raise with high equity draws that have to fold to an all-in. Have to is apparently wrong. That must fold to an all-in. You must fold to an all-in. I'm sure some people are going to ask that in the chat. What if you check raise the 9-8 and they go all in? Do you call? No, you do not call. You're not getting the right pot odds. Look, have to again. You must. English is hard. All right, let's take a look at another spot. 40 big blinds deep. Low jack raises. You call the big blind. All right, so you notice you have same range as the previous spot. Flop comes 9-8-3. You check. Low jack's going to be betting this scenario less often because the 9-8-3 lines up better with the big blinds range. So what do we do on the 9-8-3? What are the open-ended draws? That's going to be Jack 10 and 7-6. Take a look at this chart here. Jack 10 never raises. 7-6 never raises. Why would these hands not raise? Well, in general, you raise less often versus larger bet sizes, okay? And when your opponent goes 3.5 big blinds, they're essentially saying, I have a decently strong range. So when you do opt to check raise here, you're going to want to have hands that are likely good but vulnerable. That's going to be top pairs. And then you're going to want to check raise with some high equity draws that can check raise and then call off against the shove. And then also some really trashy draws. So what are really trashy draws on 9-8-3? Well, we see here, Jack-7 suited and 10-6 suited are our preferred bluffs. Also, we have 6-5 offsuit down here going for the bluff as well. So gut shots, which makes sense. You don't really mind check raising the gut shot and having to fold if you get jammed. Notice our high equity draw is actually Queen-Jack suited. You may say, why check raise Queen-Jack instead of Jack-10? Because when you do check raise Queen-Jack suited here, by the way, you do call off. You may say, huh? Well, you realize when you check raise, you're going to make it something like 9 big blinds. If your opponent shoves for, whatever, 29 more, you're now getting about 2-to-1 pot odds. You got to call it off. Is it 2-to-1 pot odds? Whatever it is. It's important to note that the Queen-Jack is actually the best draw on this board. If your opponent does have a hand like Jack-10 and they opt to rip it in, your Queen-Jack is crushing them. If they happen to have 10-7 and they rip it in, your Queen-Jack is crushing them. This is a somewhat common pattern you'll see where when we do start to get shallow stacked, the absolute best draw available will check raise and then just not fold. And that's what Queen-Jack is doing in this scenario. But very importantly, Jack-10 is not raising. And on this specific spot, 7-6 is not raising as well. Do not think that you have to raise with your draws on the flop every time. Number 3. Many players fail to bluff the river when they miss. I know, again, from you all telling me hand histories, that you all do not go for it often enough on the river. You chicken out. Don't be a chicken. Be a champion instead. Let's take a look at this scenario. 40 big blinds deep. You raise the low jack. The big blind calls. Flop comes 9-8-3. Big blind checks. You bet 3.5 big blinds. Big blind calls. Opposite situation of the previous hand, right? Turns a 4 of hearts. Big blind checks. Now on this very dynamic board, meaning there are lots of draws available, but no super nut hand already, like a straight or a flush. When you bet in position, you're going to be betting very polarized, meaning you're betting your best hands and some draws, which is this entire range here. So let's take a look at this hand, this range that's betting the turn. All of these hands would have bet the turn. So we have aces, kings, queens, jacks, tens, lots of nines, and then sporadic overcards for just airball bluffs, and then lots of flush draws. Right? So that makes sense. We have very good made hands, we have junky bluffs, and we have high equity bluffs. That is basically always what you're going to be betting with when you are betting large and infrequently on the turn. So anyway, you bet large, big blind calls. On every single river, ace-5, ace-2, queen-jack, queen-10, and jack-10 bluff all in for 21 big blinds some portion of the time. All of these hands are bluffing sometimes when they miss. You may be shocked to see that, but some portion of the time they are. We're going to go through all of them, and I'm going to show you. But we're going to go through lots of rivers. So I'm going to show you that all these hands are bluffing some portion of the time, even when the river comes out really, really bad for you. So here's what we do on the ace river. On the ace river, all the hands in red are shoving. All the hands in green are checking. The hands in gray are not in your range. So notice here, the aces get to shove for value, so these are not bluffs anymore. But take a look at queen-jack, queen-10, and jack-10. These are open-ended or gut-shot straight draws that bet the flop and bet the turn. Notice they are bluffing this ace of clubs river. Notice the flush does not come in. They're bluffing this river some portion of the time. Jack-10 bluffs very often, queen-jack and queen-10 less often. But again, they're bluffing all in some portion of the time here. A lot of people chicken out, and you can't be a chicken. Don't be a chicken. What about on the king of clubs river? Same exact scenario, but the river's the king of clubs instead. Now, at this point, again, queen-jack, queen-10, and jack-10 are all still nothing. And notice they're actually betting all in even more often in this spot. That's because we have a lot of kings that were bluffs in our turn bluffing range. Notice we had king, queen, king-jack, and king-10, all of which become good enough to value bet. Also notice now, ace-5 and ace-2, which are busted straight draws and flush draws, are now bluffing all in as well. So as you see, you're bluffing in this scenario very often. I think a lot of people find these bluffs because the ace and the king river are like obviously good for the flop and turn better. Let's take a look now at perhaps less good rivers. Here we have a 6 river. Not as good, not as good, because now on a 6 river, if your opponent just has top pair, they're never folding, right? And if you take a look now, despite the fact that the river is pretty bad, ace-5 and ace-2 still bluff all in every time. Jack-10, queen-jack, and queen-10, not so much, but we see like queen-jack offsuit, when you have it, is bluffing all in half the time. Queen-10 offsuit about 30% of the time. Jack-10, not that often, but a little bit, right? And that's what I'm trying to show you. Even though you're not bluffing every time now on this kind of bad river, it is still sometimes. What about on a 3 of clubs river? This is a really bad river, because now if they have a 9, they're just never, ever, 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 ever folding. Plus, there's sometimes a bottom pair that made the nuts. Despite that, on the river, after betting the flop and betting the turn, ace-5 and ace-2, again, bluffing all in very often. Queen-jack, queen-10, jack-10, not bluffing that often again, but when you have it about half the time with queen-jack and queen-10 and a tiny frequency with jack-10. So they're still getting after it. What about on the 8 of clubs river? A very bad river for you. Notice now, you got to chill out a little bit, okay? You got to chill out a little bit on the 8 of clubs, because the opponent will check call the flop with an 8, check call the turn with an 8, and they're never folding the river with an 8, and they're never folding the river with a 9. This is about the worst card in the deck for you. So, on the worst card in the deck for you, notice, ace-5 now chills out. Ace-2 suited, though, still bluffing about 25% of the time. Queen-jack, queen-10, jack-10, not bluffing nearly as often. Call it 10% of the time each, but 10% of the time is a real amount. Now, you may think, all right, I'm just going to check it back every time so I can be nice and easy and implementable and not get in too much trouble. But if you check it back every single time in these scenarios, you're probably leaving a little bit of money on the table, and that money is going to your opponents, which is bad. I'm trying to teach you here how to crush your opponents, and this is a spot where you need to be going for it. Exploitatively, which we're not even talking about, we've only talked about GTO world today, a lot of people will even fold some 9s in this scenario. You may not believe me, but if you bet the flop, bet the turn, and then jam the river, some of your weaker opponents will have a hand like 10-9 and think, well, if you're betting here, it must be beat. And they're going to fold. And to be fair, look at your value range. Aces, kings, queens, jacks, 10s, 9-8 for full house, pocket 8s, pocket 9s. Notice marginal 9s aren't betting. And it's true. When you do bet the flop and the turn and the river, very often you are going to have your opponent beat. And they're going to fold more often than they should. So if anything, you should probably be bluffing more than I've even shown you here. Don't tell your opponents that. It'd be crazy to have a YouTube channel and tell your opponents that, huh? That's gonna be it for today. Hope you enjoyed today's video. If you did, please click the like and subscribe button below. Make sure you avoid these mistakes. Suited connectors are great. They're some of my favorite hands, but they are easy to mess up, which is why you have to make a point to study a lot. Like I said earlier, we have cash game and tournament masterclasses at pokercoaching.com where we show you how to play lots of common scenarios. And well, suited connectors are covered a ton, and I want to be sure you don't mess up these spots. But these 3 scenarios, people mess up a lot. They call too often pre-flop, just trying to flop the nuts, especially when they get shallow stacked and they bleed away their stack. They also play their draws too aggressively on the flop. They think that they have a draw, they can't win at the showdown, they must raise. And that is definitely not true. And a lot of people fail to bluff off on the river when they miss, and this results in them just giving up the pot too often and letting their opponent realize their equity easily. So don't do that. Good luck, have fun, make the most of your opportunities. Click the like and subscribe button. Thank you for being here, and I'll talk to you next time.